You want to turn the video on too? That'll work.
Here we go.
Thank you very much. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You can probably tell that I am not Ken Goodman. You know, he's the good-looking guy. I'm the not-so-good-looking guy. He has another commitment today that he couldn't attend, so it's my pleasure. I'm Tom Champney. I teach anatomy and dabble in bioethics, and I have the pleasure of introducing Eli Shupe, who's going to be the speaker for today. Eli comes to us from the University of Texas at Arlington, where she's a bioethicist. She's been recently doing uncovered some work actually on the use of the unclaimed bodies in body donation industry and that area. And so she's come here and spent the last week and a half with us, seeing how the body donor programs work, seeing how things going on. And we have the pleasure of having Eli speak to us today about the ethics of the use of unclaimed bodies in science and medicine, et cetera. So with that, I will pass it over to Eli and she can continue from here. You're welcome to write your questions in the chat if you'd like, but we will have time at the end for questions and answers as well. So either one of those works. Eli, it's all yours.
All right, we're just getting the PowerPoint set up.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
No.
Wait, I would like to see the PowerPoint as I go.
Okay, all good.
Yeah, we're just trying to get the PowerPoint on this side.
Again,
There we
can
go.
you minimize the people too so I can read my slides? There we
There you
go.
And you can actually get rid of that thing on the top if you want to.
I don't-
You click more.
That shouldn't be an issue.
Okay. And then you go down to hide. There you go.
Okay.
Hide floating float. There you go.
Thank you. I'm learning. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tom, and for everybody attending here today. It's been a real privilege to observe your donor program and all of the other good work that you do here. So I'm going to be speaking about the use of unclaimed bodies in medical education.
Yeah, just click on it.
There we go.
and then you go down.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking at sort of a high level of generality during this presentation, but you can press me for clarifications and further details during Q&A. So to start with, the human bodies and body parts that are used for teaching and training in the United States come from three primary sources. Donors via academic body donation programs or state anatomical boards, as is the case in Florida. Donors via private body brokers like Science Care. And then thirdly, unclaimed bodies. Okay, so historically in the United States, unclaimed bodies and executed prisoners were the primary source of human remains for use in medical education. With the passage of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, which was swiftly adopted in all US states in the 60s, people then had the right to donate their bodies to science themselves voluntarily. And since that, more and more of the donors in the United States are willed body donors, and indeed the majority now are. So when I use the word unclaimed body, that's something of a term of art. It might sound strange. So we'll start by talking about what or who is an unclaimed body. So unclaimed bodies are human remains that have been positively identified, but for whom no one has stepped forward to arrange for burial or cremation. So positively identified is important here. I'm not, for the most part, talking about unidentified bodies. Usually what happens to those is different. Okay, these are bodies we know who they were in life, but nobody has stepped forward to claim that body. There might be no next of kin, they might be estranged from next of kin, or next of kin might just not be able to take on the financial responsibility of claiming the body and directing it to a funeral home for disposition. Okay. Or maybe they don't want to, right? Not everybody loves every uncle. So the county in which an unclaimed person dies is typically responsible for the disposition of their body. In a couple of cases, it's handled by states, but very small states, but usually this is worked out at the county level. Okay, so when somebody's body goes unclaimed, it falls to the county to arrange for disposition. So in most parts of the United States, including Florida, it's legal for counties to offer unclaimed bodies to medical schools and other institutions of higher learning, where they are then used in teaching and research. Okay, and some exceptions to this are Hawaii, Vermont, and Minnesota. And New York has also banned the practice in cities with populations greater than 1 million. Okay, but for the most part in the rest of the United States, this is a fully legal practice. And in essentially all the jurisdictions where the donation of unclaimed bodies is legal, it is permitted even without the prior consent of the deceased or permission from their next of kin. Okay, so stepping back a little, looking at the status of the use of unclaimed bodies worldwide, this is an IFAA update to data from a paper by Kivik and co-authors, 2018. And you can see how different countries in the world procure the bodies that they use in medical teaching. So in these dark green countries like Canada and Australia, exclusively willed body donors are used. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, and I apologize if you're colorblind, the orange countries use exclusively unclaimed bodies. Okay, so kind of a similar breakdown there. Then in the middle, you have countries that use mostly unclaimed and countries that use mostly donated. So the United States falls in that last category. And you'll notice that's actually an unusual category. There aren't a lot of countries that, for the most part, used willed body donors, but then supplement that use with unclaimed bodies, right? So China is another. So you can see the US is actually in a minority in that respect. There are far more countries that use either exclusively donated or exclusively unclaimed. So how common is this practice in the United States? It's legal in most jurisdictions, but that doesn't mean it happens in most jurisdictions. And we actually have very little information about this. This isn't tracked at the federal level. We have no idea how many people are registered with programs to be body donors. We have absolutely no idea how many unclaimed bodies nationwide are used every year. We do know a little bit about how many medical schools accept unclaimed bodies, but again, just a bit. So a 2019 survey of anatomy course leaders at US medical schools found that slightly over 12% of those course leaders indicated the possible use of unclaimed bodies at their institution. But note that the response rate for this survey, which was very targeted at the use of unclaimed bodies, was 61%, which isn't a terrible response rate for a survey, but I think that self-selection is a really strong possibility, because if you're a program that heavily makes use of the unclaimed, you might have some incentive not to disclose that and draw attention to the issue, even an anonymized survey, right? Okay. So that was the best available information when I entered this literature, which kind of a whole story in and of itself. I had found out they were using unclaimed bodies at my area medical school, and I wanted to know more. And I was really disappointed by the dearth of information. I wanted to know which medical schools in Texas besides the one in my city did this. And I wanted to know how many unclaimed bodies were used. And none of this data was being recorded, or was available easily. And there were no studies at all. There are no studies besides this one, I think, that actually looks at the number of unclaimed bodies. Okay, so I did this study that looked at all of the medical schools in Texas. We used the Freedom of Information Act for the public schools, and the private schools in our sample volunteered their data to me willingly, which was nice, because then we were able to get a comprehensive sample. And so we looked at their procurement between 2017 and 2021. So during this period, what we found was that 2 schools in this period were engaged in the direct procurement and use of unclaimed bodies, which means they received unclaimed bodies from Texas counties via interlocal agreements. 4 schools we categorized as possible use, and what that means is the 2 schools who directly procured unclaimed bodies had very large amounts of bodies and often transferred those bodies to other schools in Texas, and some out of state actually. But so there were 4 other Texas schools who had received transfers from the two schools. Okay. And then 8 schools had no use or no possible use. And this is just in their anatomy program, in their anatomy teaching. So other units at those universities I can't speak to. Okay, so this is a not trivial number, right? Especially when you account for possible use, maybe not very alarming or very unexpected, but what was unexpected was what we discovered when we looked at the number of unclaimed bodies being procured in those trends. So what we found was that the number of unclaimed bodies that were being acquired rose very precipitously during the years of our study, going from 64 in 2017 to 446 in 2021. And so this is an increase of, something like slightly over 2% to slightly over 14%. It was a 7-fold increase, and not just in terms of the number of unclaimed bodies, but in the proportion of the bodies that are unclaimed. So it's not like they got more bodies overall. And that's the reason why these numbers go up. Specifically, you see growth in how many unclaimed bodies are being procured from counties. Okay, so that was really surprising because there's very little awareness of the use of unclaimed bodies in medicine outside of anatomy. And where there is an awareness among other medical professionals, there is a perception that this practice, if it still occurs, is on the decline. Okay, it's something that's sort of dying out. What we found was that in Texas, one of the most populous states in the country, this was not at all the case. And something that's important to note here is, right, because this procurement will often be justified in terms of necessity, but something that's important to note is that there is no shortage of willing donors in the United States. According to a recent study, 70% of academic body donation programs say that they receive enough bodies, 17% receive a surplus, and only 13% say they receive too few. As my colleague here, Tom Champney, University of Miami, has put it, scarcity is a red herring. Okay, so what's the incentive here? Well, there's two sides to the picture, right? What's the incentive for counties to donate these bodies, and what's the incentive for medical schools to accept them? So on the county side, it's cost savings. Every body that gets accepted by a medical school, and I'm generalizing here, right? Mortuary schools often accept them too. So for instance, in the state of Georgia, they all go to mortuary colleges for the most part. But if an institution accepts an unclaimed body, the county typically no longer has to pay for the disposition of those remains. So they don't have to pay for cremation, right? They can be saving, at least $600 usually, often far more, right? Because there's transportation costs, et cetera, that the schools will often bear. That wouldn't be the case in Florida because your state anatomical board levies a fee for transportation and embalming, but most places don't. So Dallas and Tarrant counties, who both had interlocal agreements with one of the medical schools in our study, claimed that they saved over $500,000 each year through this agreement. One of the perks of their agreement was that the medical school, which had their own crematory, would also cremate the bodies they could not accept, right? Inappropriate size, too much decomposition, infectious disease. They would also cremate those for the county at a reduced rate of only, I think, $300 or $350, which is very cheap for cremation. Okay, so even the bodies that weren't accepted, they cut a deal on. Okay, so for the counties, they save a lot of money here. For the institutions, well, they have more bodies to work with, and in some cases, there appears to be a profit incentive also. So the University of North Texas Health Science Center, for instance, made over $1 million a year, essentially leasing out remains to industry partners using their elite bioskills lab. Okay, which they advertised on their website partly on the basis of how many donors their clients would have access to. Okay. So it was actually enough of a money-making enterprise that the university invested significant money into funding a state-of-the-art bioskills lab, primarily for this purpose. Okay, so partly as a result of the research that I did on, well, I mean, like directly domino effect as a result of that research that I did in Texas. Texas has sort of been in the spotlight lately for this practice. So NBC assigned a couple of investigative journalists after this research was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And after a year of investigative work, they published what is now like a 6 or something part series on what was happening in North Texas at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. So this is the first time the use of unclaimed bodies has kind of hit national news properly. So the one comparable thing I can think of is in New York State. In the mid 2010s, it rose to awareness in that state that unclaimed bodies were being used for medical teaching, which actually led to the legislation that banned it in large cities in New York. That was really the only comparably big public conversation that's happened around this issue, right? Anatomy has been in the news, but usually for other things like program directors misappropriating remains and stuff entering the black market and things like that. So this is kind of a pivotal moment for anatomy in some ways, in that we're finally staging these public conversations about the ethics of what is, in many respects, kind of an antiquated practice. And in light of the fact that this reckoning is taking place, I think it's important to acknowledge that anatomists and bioethicists and medical professionals more generally should be participants in that conversation. So that's what I'm hoping to do a bit of today. So that's I've done some empirical work on the use of the unclaimed, but now I've turned to theoretical work. Okay, so what I'm going to argue for today is that the unconsented use of the unclaimed needs to end. At a moral minimum, I think medical schools should refuse to accept unclaimed bodies in the absence of either the prior consent of the deceased or explicit permission from their next of kin. And I think this is a moral minimum. Okay, you might have reason to be even more stringent, to worry about familial consent in a case where the family can't afford to claim the remains, right? Do they really have a relevant alternative to donation in that kind of case? What does the county offer? What resources are available for indigent burial, for example, right? So you might think we need an even stronger moral bar, but at a moral minimum, this is the change that I'm going to argue for. So I'm going to present very quickly, respecting your time, 4 arguments against accepting unclaimed bodies. And I'm going to present 2 counter arguments to defenses of the practice that I've encountered. 2 counter arguments against what I think are sort of the most promising defenses. And I'm going to go over these, at a level of generality, but in the Q&A, we can return to them in greater depth. So the first and arguably most fundamental reason that the unclaimed should not be used for medical teaching is that they have not consented to dissection. Of course, dead people can't consent. So what I mean is that, they haven't given their prior consent, and in many cases, their next of kin have not given permission. And so this is in tension with how we think about the rights of even the dead in medicine. So I think organ transplantation and organ donation and transplantation is the obvious analogy here, where this doesn't really occur systematically in terms of procuring organs, right? And you can probably think of lots of good reasons why it shouldn't. And I invite you to just apply those reasons to this other context too. I have heard, informally of some cases where something like this has happened with organs, where a hospital manager who's at the bottom of that, that decision-making hierarchy will sign for that, but it's rare. Okay, so, and I think most people would think it's not ethically appropriate in the transplant literature. So I'm a transplant bioethicist, is where I'm approaching this issue from. Okay, we also can't use presumed consent as a model to justify the donation of the unclaimed. For one, what we know about the preferences of the living suggests that the majority of people don't necessarily have a positive preference to be dissected after their death. And Furthermore, and more importantly, very few people know that the unclaimed are ever donated to medical science. People cannot foresee this happening to them. You can't use a model of presumed consent unless people understand that it's something that might happen to them and that they might need to take measures to prevent or opt out of. Right? So their preferences and, more importantly, their expectations make presumed consent inapplicable here. The second argument relates to direct harm. So I argue that this practice is in fact directly harmful in many ways. So harmful to whom is the obvious question. Is it harmful to the deceased? Well, maybe, maybe not, right? It's a rich philosophical question about whether you can harm the dead, okay? You might think that, that's gonna depend on your metaphysics of the afterlife or something, or, whether or not somebody's legacy or preferences persist in a way that they can be violated in a substantial way, okay? I don't think we need to take a stand on whether we can directly harm the deceased as opposed to like their memory or something. I don't because I think that the harms to the living are unquestionable here and are on their own morally persuasive, right? So who's harmed among the living? Well, most directly the loved ones of the deceased. So not all unclaimed bodies have no loved ones. Okay, many of these people had friends in life and family. Some of them weren't claimed for financial reasons. Dallas County, for example, would donate people even when they had next of kin who didn't want them to, right? They just signed a different form saying the next of kin refused to sign the transfer agreement. In other cases, people have been unable to be contacted, their relative has been donated, and they find out later, sometimes years later, that their body was dissected. And there are family members who have spoken about the felt violation that they experienced. I think, so Victor Honey, one of the men the NBC reporting wrote about who was donated, his sister, told reporters that it felt like a hole in her heart, right, that this had happened without her knowledge or permission. There's also harm to communities here, right? So especially in the United States, there's a really dark and storied history of racially targeted grave robbing. Okay, after grave robbing was made illegal, it still happened. It just only happened in communities with the fewest resources to resist it. And so these were often African American, indigenous, and immigrant communities. In fact, in parts of the American South, you have these sort of like remnants of this practice that still exist in folklore, right? There's a folkloric figure called the night doctor, right? This kind of doctor who, takes your body or maybe even kills you to use you for research, okay? So, this practice was recognized and was salient enough that there's like a boogeyman that has sprung up from it, okay? So it's really understandable to see how somebody in, for instance, an African-American community might perceive the systematic use of the bodies of poor people in their communities by, sometimes white doctors as a perpetuation of these harms. They might experience it as a harm. And finally, medical students, right? The very people that these bodies are meant to benefit. At some institutions that use unclaimed bodies, the medical students are not told. So the institution in Texas is an example. I was the one to tell some of the medical students that their bodies may not be donors, okay? And those students reacted to that information overwhelmingly in a negative way, right? They felt betrayed by their program, and they felt as if they had been lied to about the kind of covenant they had between themselves and their donor, who they understood to be somebody who gave a gift so that they could learn. Okay, so these students felt betrayed. There's a really good piece by a doctor, now former medical student, Mary Peeler, in the New England Journal of Medicine, where she talks about her experience in Maryland at Johns Hopkins, finding out that she had dissected an unclaimed body. And I don't have my notes on the screen, but she says something like she still wrestles with the fact that her donor may not have given consent or hadn't given consent. It's something that she wrestles with. And she actually led sort of a group of students who helped end the practice of using the unclaimed at Johns Hopkins. Okay, so these are real harms, real direct harms. I'm going to talk a little bit about indirect harms also. But first, let's discuss justice, right? One of the 4 principles of biomedical ethics. Okay, this practice is unjust. The people whose bodies go unclaimed, if you look at the demographic data, are disproportionately those people that have already faced marginalization, discrimination, and economic hardship in life. There's, again, not a lot of good data with like high-powered studies, but there are a few county-level studies on the demographics of the unclaimed dead. So Los Angeles County is one, and then I don't recall the other county. But what those researchers have found is that in the counties they've looked at, the unclaimed are more likely to be male, disproportionately likely to be Black, more likely to have been estranged from family, more likely to have faced economic hardship. And this isn't really a surprise, right? Because these are people whose bodies have not been claimed, right? And either the presence of estrangement and financial hardship are sort of the 2 primary reasons that might happen, right? Obviously, the economic injustice is significant, right? There's sort of I like to tell people when I give a version of this talk that there's 2 ways that you can become a body donor well, I used to say this in North Texas, although that's changed now, thankfully. And one is that you can sign a bunch of forms with 2 witnesses, right? Everything above board. They really care that those witnesses see you sign, or you can just die poor. So there's a double standard here in terms of what programs want to see from their donors or their donors' families, depending on the circumstances, the economic circumstances in which those people died. And as I intimated before, the injustice here is racial as well as economic. When you look at the demographics of the unclaimed and you look at the demographics of willed body donors, the overwhelming majority of willed body donors are white, although here that might not be the case because you have such a bust. It's still mostly white?
Yes.
Okay, because I've noticed a lot of Hispanic donors in the files.
Not as many.
Not as many.
As the population.
Oh, I guess, yeah. So overwhelmingly white. In North Texas, this difference was particularly striking, where sometimes students would ask me, how do I know if my body was unclaimed? And I was like, sometimes say, is your body Black? Because in North Texas, the numbers of body donors who were white was like very much approaching on like totality. So that's really striking. In fact, so one counter argument that I'm not going to discuss today, but which the program in North Texas deployed, was that this was actually a really good thing for diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it made sure that their students had access to bodies that were representative of the populations they were serving. But I think that woke grave robbing isn't the way to achieve your DEI goals. I think that's not good. Okay. The 4th argument I want to touch on about why we shouldn't use unclaimed bodies for medical teaching is that it poses a significant risk to public trust, especially now as a system. So when nobody knew this happened, right? It's like, well, public trust wasn't really being harmed in most cases because people weren't aware of it. Okay. There were still all these other reasons why it was wrong. But now, as it's starting to come to light, right, with this NBC coverage, there's increasing public awareness that this is happening. So the continued use of unclaimed bodies at this point has the real potential to damage public trust in healthcare and in medical professionals. Okay, and that loss in public trust isn't just like, oh, it's sad, people don't trust us as much. It has real downstream consequences, real direct health consequences too, right? It leads, and you can see there's been studies because especially in the African American community, which has higher than baseline levels of mistrust in healthcare, there have been studies that correlate the levels of mistrust that people have negatively with certain health outcomes and health behaviors like medication adherence, seeking clinical care. All of these are strongly correlated with trust, negatively correlated, right? So you're going to see the exacerbation of existing inequalities, the perceivably decreased compliance with emergency public health measures, lower rates of participation in medical research and voluntary organ donation, I think would not be surprising. But again, like we kind of veer into the speculative here at the end of this list. I think that it may very well undermine the majority source of keeping bodies in the United States, which is willed body donors, right? How, so I had a colleague whose mother-in-law was donated to science, and I told him about my research. He had actually donated, they donated his wife's mother to the medical school that was taking the unclaimed bodies that I was discovering. And when I told him about this, his face just fell, right? He felt like it really cheapened the gift that his mother and they had made to the medical school, right? People in the context of, I think that knowing that there's another pipeline to anatomical use may well make people more reluctant to become willing donors themselves. All right, so I'm going to briefly discuss two counter arguments to my claim that this is unethical and should stop. And these are sort of like the two most robust counter arguments, I think. So that DEI one, for example, I'm not going to talk about, although I've heard it. And the first, and I think the strongest argument is something that I call the stewardship argument. And the argument goes roughly as follows. Access to bodies is importantly beneficial to medical education. There's currently more demand than bodies than there is supply. Accordingly, bodies are a scarce and valuable resource. Therefore, the procurement and use of unclaimed bodies in teaching is permissible on the basis of responsible resource stewardship. And you sometimes see stronger versions of this claim that say not only is it permissible, but not using them is morally impermissible because it's a sort of wastage that would constitute a failure of responsible resource stewardship. Okay, my response to this is to accept that bodies are importantly beneficial. There are some people who try to say, oh, but technology is increasing, blah, blah, blah. But I tend to defer to anatomists who say that whole body dissection is like a really important part of students' education and an important rite of passage in many ways too, culturally, and in inculcating them to the norms of medicine. Okay, but as we discussed before, I just don't think that we see the kind of scarcity that could drive justifying this practice. There are relevant alternatives. These scarcity arguments are much weaker when relevant alternatives exist, here in the form of willed body donors. If the amount of willed body donors weren't enough, there are still other measures you could take before resorting to unclaimed bodies. For instance, increasing public awareness of body donation, which tends to be quite low. And I think the success of for-profit body brokers like Science Care in recruiting donors shows how much a little advertising can do, or in their case, a lot. Also, although I do think bodies are valuable, it's important to note that they're not directly life-saving in the way that organs are, okay? I think this argument has a lot more force in the context of like something like organ conscription or something, or like opt-out organ donation, where the scarcity is much larger. The relevant alternatives aren't really there yet, although my fingers are crossed on the xenotransplantation front. And the direct life-saving benefit is very large. Okay, here the benefits are more indirect. Okay, so I don't think the stewardship argument works. There's also plasticity on the end of programs. If they don't fall short of their benchmark in 1 year, they can adjust student ratios, right? There are things that they can do. And then the second counter argument I'm going to touch on is something that I call the uncertainty argument, which I hear a lot from the academic body programs themselves that use unclaimed bodies. And this goes something like this. The donation of unclaimed bodies to medical science is ethically impermissible in cases where the preferences of the deceased are unknown. That's going to be a large amount of cases when it comes to unclaimed bodies. Okay. Two, if we do not know what the deceased would have wanted, then any mode of disposition might violate their preferences. Three, so why not donate them, right? Not donating them might be just as bad. Okay, this is a really bad argument philosophically. So this is lazy and sloppy decision theory. Okay, it ignores best practices for both proxy decision making, which is widely used all across medicine, and the decision theory about reasoning under uncertainty. Doesn't even attempt to deploy any sophisticated way to reason under uncertainty. So for one, it inaccurately assigns all possible preferences the same credence, right? Makes it sound like it's a matter of chance as to which course of action will be a preference violation. That's just not true. We can look at people's stated preferences during life and we can generalize when we have demographic data about the unclaimed person. Well, if they're African American, chances that they would want to be dissected are probably lower, for example, because you see lower rates of organ donation in that community, for example, higher rates of medical mistrust. Okay, so it fails to take all of those things into account, and it also makes the mistake of treating all possible preference violations as equally serious. So, for instance, somebody who would have liked to be donated, if they're, no one knows about it and their body goes unclaimed, if they're then donated, that's kind of more an omission rather than an action, because it's, they probably didn't expect to be donors absent having signed a consent for that, right? Not being used when you would have liked to be used is maybe just, it's a disappointment, it's unfortunate, okay? But having your body dissected when that's something you would not have wanted, I think that is a serious violation of the deceased person's preferences if you think that those matter, right? There are many religious groups that are opposed to whole body donation, even ones that are in favor of organ donation, right? Partly because the direct life-saving benefit is lower. It's also more intimate in many ways, right? You're going to be seen naked. You're going to be potentially, depending on the program, your body's not going to remain intact in the same way, right? Your feet might go to the podiatry department at school, right? Your spine might go to a chiropractic workshop, right? People tend to feel uncomfortable about that when they're aware of it. So this is just really bad decision theory, and it's disappointing to see people who are often medical professionals deploying it because they know better, because they do proxy decision making in other contexts. Okay, so my take-home message is basically that my view is that the use of unclaimed bodies in medical teaching and research is morally unacceptable. At a minimum, body donation programs should insist on the prior consent of the deceased or the explicit permission of their next of kin. In Texas, we've seen a lot of changes. So I've been lobbying for change in Texas since I learned about this in 2021, but it took that national news story to get real change happening. But we have seen change. So the Will Body program at the medical school that was accepting unclaimed bodies has been suspended. The leadership have been dismissed. Both Tarrant and Dallas County have implemented policies saying they will not donate the unclaimed. I actually worked with Tarrant County to help craft their new indigent burial policy. There is a Texas state senator who actually did just introduce a bill in the state Senate to prohibit the use of people's bodies unless they or their next of kin give consent. So we've seen a lot of good change in Texas. If this state legislation goes through, Texas might be one of the few states in the country that explicitly prohibit this. Okay, so we might go from being in the spotlight in an uncomfortable way over there in Texas to, being kind of a model that other states might follow. But in all the focus on the University of North Texas Health Science Center and in the media over this issue, something that I see falling out of the conversation is the fact that this is not a Texas issue exclusively. There is nothing special about Texas, except that everything's bigger and the margaritas are really good, right? Unclaimed bodies are still in use all over the country. I know of schools in multiple states that do, not just in the South, in the very prestigious schools on the East Coast, okay? You know of an Ivy that does, right? This is a national issue. And I think we can anticipate there being more news coverage in the context of other schools. So I think there is a strong need for regulation here. Tom can tell you how under-regulated body donation is in general. Here, I think, is one area where we might be able to get some consensus, right? Because companies like the for-profit body brokers don't really use the unclaimed in high numbers. I've encountered like a couple of cases, but for the most part, that's not where their profit margins are. So they're not going to be lobbying against this kind of legislative move. So I think there should be state and even federal legislation put in place to prohibit the use of unclaimed bodies in this way. In the absence of regulations, counties can adopt policies against the practice. Even counties that are not donor counties, right, who aren't divesting from doing this, can put it in their policies that this does not occur. Can specify, no, look, we have these funeral homes on rotation, we'll pay for cremation. Okay. In the meantime, in the absence of that kind of regulative force, I think institutions of higher learning should proactively divest. And I don't want to take up too much time, so I will probably stop, but I think that there are a variety of steps that an institution trying to divest here can take and should take. I think, so like, being committed to transparency, acknowledging what, their past actions, removing the unclaimed bodies currently in use, dignified cremation or burial of the above, and adoption of policies specifying minimal ethical standards for whole body procurement and use, and the establishment of an anatomical oversight committee. So you can check out the recent task force report from the American Association for Anatomy, published this year, that has a lot of these good recommendations. Although I will note that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Okay, and institutions can still make progress even while situationally deferring to pragmatics on particular action items. Like, it might be really hard if you're relying on a bunch of unclaimed bodies to pull them out of the anatomy lab in the middle of a semester of students' course, right? Or, how is this going to apply to things like skeletal collections, right? That can be hard, okay? Or ongoing clinical research. So if you'd like to explore this issue in greater detail, as of this week, yay, I have an expanded version of this work forthcoming at the Journal of Medical Ethics, and that should be out in a few weeks. And you can also contact me for a draft at my email there, or if you just want to chat about this issue, I'm always happy to talk. And I will sort of turn it over to questions, but I talked for way longer than I meant to. This is a philosopher curse.
So just gonna get us out of there so everybody can see. Do we have any questions from the audience? As speaker, I always get the first preference. So I will jump in first, but then I'd love to hear other people chatting as well if they'd like.
The messages.
I
have a comment later.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Eli, again for the talk.
Thank you, yeah.
I think it's a good one. I'll ask you two questions, I guess.
Mhm.
The first one is, do we really have any idea how many unclaimed are used in the United States?
We have no idea. We only have good data for Texas because I went out and gathered it. There has been no state study in any other state. If you are in a state that's not Texas and you want to do this state study in your state, email me. I would love to collaborate and tell you about my methodologies. And I won't pretend you need me to help analyze the data, since you can do that in an Excel sheet in 2 minutes, but I would love to be a part of those projects.
Yeah, I'd like to also mention, just for everybody around, we in Florida do not, it's legally permissible to have unclaimed bodies sent to sent to medical schools, et cetera. It's actually in the Florida state law, but the anatomical board in Florida will not accept unclaimed bodies.
Great.
We've made it a policy of the board to not do that. So we do not accept unclaimed bodies as a policy, but not as a legal thing. It's actually truly legal here in the state of Florida. We just won't do it.
Good point. So some of that preemptive policy work can happen at the level of a state anatomical board.
Or at individual programs.
Yeah.
They're going as well, okay? And then I'll come back to the other point or the little question, and that is, who cares? They're dead. That's what a lot of people say.
They do say that, but I think the living care. The living clearly care, right? They express profound feelings of violation when they discover a relative has had this happen to them. And I think that alone is enough to ground not doing this. If it were directly life-saving to a huge degree, or maybe the person died of this rare and infectious disease, the next COVID or something, then I think you might have a case, right, in that instance. But just for teaching use when there are relevant alternatives, I don't think the mere fact that they're dead is enough, to override, all of the other ethical reasons not to do it.
Well, before we get to the speakers online, I know Sergio has a point.
Well, it's a comment, not a question.
Yeah.
I was at medical school in 1974, so you can guess how old I am. That was my first year, and in anatomy, back in Argentina, which I saw in your map, that still they're using unclaimed bodies. It's one of the few countries actually that it's totally using unclaimed bodies, and maybe some donation, which I don't think there's anybody donating. Of course, back those days, we didn't have any concern about what we knew that most of our bodies at the University of Buenos Aires came from the mental hospital. People that had no one there, they were maybe homeless, people with mental issues, they end up.
Yeah, and that's a common source for unclaimed bodies that you see.
But my comment, and again, it's not a question, but it's a comment. I'm wondering, because I have contact with medical students these days, and fast forward, still, as you saw in your map, you put in your map, still they are using unclaimed bodies. And this is not a concern. I mean, it's about the necessity of using bodies for trying to understand how the muscles are inserted, how the organs are, how to do dissection, dismember, using bones, all the things that you know, I mean, all the different. And I wonder whether this is a particular concern from this society or many other societies similar to that, as we saw in the map. And because most of Latin American countries, they use unclaimed bodies, and it's in many of those. And again, there are many other reasons for being concerned, ethically speaking, but not particularly where assuming that those bodies were unclaimed and not victims of murder or something like that. So it's a reflection again. It's not a question, but
thank you for that comment. So I do think that a lot of this is culturally specific, and I mean my argument very much to be targeted at the American context, especially somewhere like Argentina, where it might be majority or exclusively unclaimed in use. It's not like you could easily just stop, right? You don't, especially if there's no donor program or donor culture built up, right? The kind of divestment you might see there would have to be a longer process, right, of building up a donor base. And there may be reasons to do that. It's also going to depend on what societal expectations are and what cultural preferences are, although Latin American countries are very Catholic. And so it's interesting to me that a number of them use only unclaimed bodies, because I mean, until kind of recently, right, cremation was strongly dispreferred by Catholics, or was not even really permitted. Yeah, okay, so you might worry about religious violations in those cases, right? So I think just because something is normalized doesn't mean it's good. Yeah, but I think it's the US's unique status as a country that uses majority donors and could rely exclusively on donors that makes their continuing use of the unclaimed particularly bad. The pragmatic dimensions are just going to be so much more unwieldy in a country that relies predominantly on the unclaimed. Yeah, so I said thank you for bringing that up.
That issue is raised around the world. In Africa, for instance, most of the bodies used are unclaimed bodies as well. Some of them are from shootouts, et cetera, with the
Mhm.
police, et cetera. And again, they're facing this same issue. And that's kind of what Sabine Hilden's question is there. You know, worldwide, the situation is different from those countries that do not have this access. And she'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So I think you kind of elaborated on that, but Sabine, you have your hand up. So maybe you'd like to elaborate a little bit more, and then we'll get Jerry.
Yeah, but let's hear from Jerry first.
Okay, Jerry, you get to go first.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. I want to focus on the term unclaimed. In your survey of various programs, did you how do they vary in how they define unclaimed? Who gets to define it? Is it
Yeah.
just nobody shows up to claim it, or do they have a checklist of criteria, you know, to try to find the person? And is there great variance among programs about what that checklist might be, if they have a checklist?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a body is unclaimed if, you know, either next of kin can't be found, or there are no next of kin, or next of kin cannot or will not claim the body. What is required in order to check that box, right? That you've attempted to locate next of kin, right? That is going to depend mostly on the county. In Texas, some of the counties were offloading that responsibility to the medical school, which was a big problem because there's a conflict of interest there, right? And it honestly, it's going to depend. Like, do you have somebody at that medical examiner's office in the county who knows how to use the internet? Okay, like, do they know how to Google a name and find relatives on Facebook? Part of the new policies Tarrant County put in place included, you know, if next of kin are identified, there needs to be attempts to contact them in at least 2 ways, right? So not just email, not just phone call, not just knocking on the door, but more than one means of contact. And what we saw in Texas was there was a lot of negligence in locating next of kin, such that there were people who had missing person reports out on family members, didn't know they were dead, and they were being dissected down the street. And those are the cases that have gotten the most attention, but like, it's not just bad if it happens to somebody who shouldn't have gone unclaimed. It's, you know, I kind of want to expand the public's attention a bit and focus it also on people who, you know, really were unclaimed. But yeah, it's going to look totally different what that due diligence process looks like across county.
And Jerry, can I just add in? There's a term called unidentified. And there are individuals that can't be identified that wind up in the county as well. And interestingly enough, counties have different ways of processing the unidentified from the unclaimed. The unclaimed, they know somebody and they can somehow, you know, report to that, do things about it, et cetera. The unidentified, they're required to keep those individuals for a while to try to figure out who they are, to try to figure out if there's some way to contact as well. And I do think that some counties don't do their due diligence in that regard as well, and will sometimes offload even the unidentified as well as the unclaimed.
Yeah, although I haven't seen that in Texas, which has a lot of unidentified bodies.
Right.
Thankfully, there are a lot of really cool things in Texas happening in regards to identifying immigrant remains, right? There are a lot of unidentified bodies of people that
The migrants on the southern border.
They deal with a ton of unclaimed bodies, and there are some anthropologists and forensic anthropologists who now work with them to help repatriate those remains. Sabine, I want to respond to your comment because I see it in the chat. I totally agree that we need to be careful about calling these unclaimed people donated or donors. And in my writing, I try to be careful about that. And I know I put some air quotes around it on one of the slides, but sometimes we'll slip when I talk. But I think that is really important, because something that I've seen like in records is like the State Anatomical Board in Texas referred to these unclaimed bodies as donations via county contract. And I thought that was an incredibly problematic phrase.
You better believe it. I see this in papers coming out of China, and it scares me to heck, you know.
It makes it hard to pull apart these cases too, right?
Yeah. So I actually also wanted to come back to Sergio's comment, and Sergio, correct me if I'm wrong, But I do hear a question in there in your comment, and this is why should we care so much nowadays that our students are working with unclaimed
No, no,
bodies
no.
and not with donated bodies?
No, Sabine, no, I wasn't saying, I wasn't saying why.
I'm just playing the devil's advocate here.
What
And
I say that it's not the main concern, and I'm trying to understand whether that is because of cultural not cultural, because, you know, culturally we are very similar, North and South. We don't
The
share.
professional culture,
But
maybe.
the contextual differences. And one
yeah,
of
and I do think, I think what has changed, since I think I probably had my dissection course around the time you had yours, except that I had mine in Germany also with unclaimed bodies. But what has changed is, and you know this better than I do, is as a bioethicist, who you are, is that the whole culture of medicine has changed, right? And so also our perception, to a certain extent, of what we should do with those persons in our surroundings, in our learning environment for our students who happen to be dead. And we afford them, and I think Eli has spelled that out quite nicely. The various criteria that basically are bioethical criteria that that also in Eli's argument are forwarded to the dead. And I think in general, it made me think very much, Eli, today, how are we dealing as a society with the dead, and more specifically as people in medicine, how are we dealing with the dead? And that sounds very, very general, but so much of what you were talking about echoes with what I'm currently doing in my daily work this week. I'm looking at archival records that my dear colleague, a medical historian from Wrocław in Krakow, in Poland, finally organized. We're looking at the municipal morgue register from the 1930s and 40s in Breslau, Germany. And, how things keep on staying the same to a certain extent, and how many echoes there are, and how we are dealing with the dead, and how we should focus better on what we're thinking and doing with them.
Go ahead.
I mean, just a comment to your point. When I was making my own comment, I have back in my mind a paper I was reading about Julius Hallenborder, which you probably know very well about him. And that was a Nazi researcher, and he was doing experiments with children. I mean, using bodies of children that had been killed at the concentration camps. And when Leo Alexander asked him what did he feel about the bodies that he was using, his answer was, knowing where those bodies came from wasn't my business. So it's, I mean, I have the same feeling of you about the moral evolution of medicine in many ways. So that was part of my comment.
Thanks.
I didn't doubt that for a minute.
Although there are interesting sort of interrelationships, especially when the unclaimed bodies are often like coming in large numbers from large psychiatric asylums. So like Claudia Krebs gave a talk recently about these Nazi anatomical atlases, and Sabine, you've been a co-author on that work. And one thing that stood out to me was she had these letters where the anatomists are writing to the director of the psychiatric hospital saying, you're not giving us enough bodies. And shortly after the letter, the death rate increases at the hospital. And I recently reviewed a paper, an ethnographic piece that looked at unclaimed bodies in Kentucky in the early, like the 1920s, coming from a psychiatric asylum. And you have the same sorts of letters from program directors to the people running the asylum saying, you're not giving us as many bodies as we understood you should be giving us, right? And
So kill some more.
yeah, one thing I put in my comment to the author, I was like, you should check the death rates around like that correspondence, right? So there are some worries about those kinds of relationships. And
so I think that's another important point. I think, Eli, also from what you were saying today, we're actually currently in those countries that have functional body donation programs, we're in the first time in history at the point where we actually have enough bodies for anatomical education and research. With the big exception of Nazi Germany, that was the only other time where there were enough bodies.
Hopefully a slightly different moral imperative there, but yeah.
Very much so. Thank you for pointing that out.
One interesting alternative to a country like Argentina that doesn't have a donor base, I mean, a lot of foreign countries just buy whole bodies from the United States from for-profit body brokers. And that's an interesting ethical question, because at least they're consented, right? So is it, I think.
Yeah, but for what?
Asked me this before, right? Like, is it better to buy a consented donor who might not know what they were consenting to fully, or to use an unclaimed local, like,
Which has never been consented whatsoever.
yeah, like, which is
Exactly.
worse, right? Well, you're propping up this industry in the one case, so it's like, that's kind of a dilemma.
Absolutely.
Any other questions from the audience?
And I think I saw somebody ask about the slides. Maybe Ken can send them out, or if you email me, I can share them.
We can post it on the website.
Oh, perfect.
I'll type in the website.
Yeah, just post them as a PDF, not a PowerPoint, because they don't want people to see
No,
all the
I
crazy
do,
stuff
don't
in the
worry.
notes section.
I posted as a.
Great.
If there aren't any other questions, we thank you all for coming. Thank you for the lively discussion
Thank you all.
and for the excellent presentation from Eli. She, of course, is more than willing to answer any other questions or chat some more offline if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, contact me. I am learning so much from everybody in the anatomy world on this project.
Thank you all, and we will see you for the next Dialogues in Research Ethics in a few weeks, probably.
Pro.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye, Sabine. See you in a week.